our rulers would like to bury Red Clydeside in its entirety, for it tells of a Scotland where people didn't sit and wait for change from London or Edinburgh. Scotland where they went out to organise real change from the bottom up, like the women of Govan who were fighting for decent housing and fair rents, or the workers and the ex-soldiers who were coming back to war, fighting to reduce the working week in the face of mass unemployment and grinding poverty. 1919 was the worst year the British establishment has faced so far. No wonder they want to eradicate all the collective memory of its working class insurgency. The failure of the revolutionary movement to break through in 1919 and the ruling class counter-offensive that came in the early 1920s led John Mclean to call for a Scottish Workers' Republic. According to his daughter and his biographer, Nan Milton, there's really little evidence that he took the question of Scottish nationalism seriously until 1920. Until then, Mclean had looked to a British revolution. He'd been involved in the hands-off Russia campaign. He'd spoken at meetings across the United Kingdom, basically arguing in defence of workers' Russia. A supporter of Irish freedom, Mclean saw how its war for independence had inspired rebellion throughout the British Empire. And at the end of 1920, he was arguing a similar fight in Glasgow could tear that empire apart. He called for a Glasgow Soviet, not a Westminster-style parliament in Edinburgh. And he wrote, the British Empire is the greatest enemy, the greatest threat to humanity. We can make Glasgow a Petrograd, a revolutionary storm centre second to none. A Scottish breakaway would bring the empire crashing to the ground and free the waiting workers of the world. English Labour is bound to respond to our call if we in Scotland strike out boldly for political conquest. I mean, Mclean's commitment was to class struggle, internationalism, and above all, anti-imperialism. He was against the British Empire. Yet his estimate, I think, that workers in Glasgow were ready to seize power in 1921 says more about John's isolation at the time than about the real balance of forces. By then, unemployment in Clydeside and in Lanarkshire and places like that had soared to 25%, 20%. And the movement in the Clyde was as weak as it was in Sheffield, really due to mass sackings, lockouts, and the victimisation of its leaders. Even if Mclean Soviet had actually come to pass, only one thing could have saved it from the barbarism inflicted in Dublin during the rising in 1916 by the British state, the British Navy and the British Army, and that was solidarity from the very English cities that John Mclean insisted lagged behind the Scots. Tragically, Mclean died at the end of 1923. He was only 44. His death was the result of poverty and exhaustion, but above all, the brutal treatment he endured in Peterhead prison on 2 occasions, first in 1916 and then in 1918. Scottish workers had held him in great esteem, and that was shown by the fact that 10,000 at least, it's estimated more than that, 10,000 workers lined the streets of Glasgow for his funeral. But sadly, Scottish Workers' Republican Party, founded near the end of his life, numbered its members in dozens, its electoral support in the hundreds. Some in the Scottish left today would look back and agree with Mclean's refusal to join the new British Communist Party when it was founded. In doing so, I think they confuse what was a vibrant new party made up of some of the leaders of the shop stewards movement and the Third International to which it belonged. They confused that with the deformed caricatures that both later became following the death of Lenin in 1924 and the rise of Stalinism in the late 1920s. Like his great contemporary, James Connolly, Mclean left little behind in the way of political organisation. But this doesn't diminish his stature for us at all. He was a consistent anti-imperialist. He argued the war was simply a repartitioning of the world between the great powers that could only lead to further imperialist war, and he was right. He wrote a great pamphlet called The War After the War that people should read, and what it predicts is that the end of the First World War would lead to further economic competition between the great powers. That would lead to the rise of Germany, the fight in the Far East over Japan and so on, and it led to the Second World War. So his prediction, he said in 15 years' time, it was actually 19 years' time, so he wasn't far out. It led to the Second World War and the war after wars that we've seen since, the rapacious wars for profit and for empire and for imperialism. In May 1918, he was charged with sedition, and he was facing 5 years hard labour in Peterhead when he told the High Court in Edinburgh, "I'm not here as the accused. I'm here as the accuser of capitalism, dripping with blood from head to foot. My appeal is to the working class, because they alone can bring about a time when the whole world will be in one brotherhood, on a sound economic foundation. That can only be obtained when the people of the world get the world and retain the world." I think Mclean is a giant whose message of revolution is as relevant now as it was 100 years ago. A world where we are facing possible extinction from ecological degradation, possible nuclear war, if there's another war like the ones we've been through, and now COVID-19 and a series of catastrophic diseases that are bred by the rapacious competition of capitalism. So I think Mclean's message should inspire our movement for independence and for system change. I'll leave it there and hope folk can come back in the contributions and discussion. Thanks.
No problem, Dave. That was fantastic. Thank you. There was there was so much there that I hope I would like to unpack with you, and that I'm sure folks will like to discuss as well. So I'll remind people that probably the easiest way this evening, if you'd like to make a point or to ask a question or raise anything with Dave, then if you would put your question or your comment in the chat box using the chat functionality at the bottom of your screen. That way I can see what's going on, and Dave can too, and we'll work our way through it that way. That's the easiest way of doing it. There's only me running this call this evening, and if I start unmuting and muting people, heaven alone knows what will happen. So the safer thing to do is for folks to put their questions and comments in there. The first thing I was going to talk, the reason when you were talking, I turned around, was you were talking about the Battle of George Square, and it crossed my mind that how many, and you were talking about some of the characters who were there, including the person who set up that. You folks maybe know I've got a legal background. That's a thing called Glogan Henderson's Law of Scotland, and for many, many years it was edited by Gerald Gordon. Gerald Gordon was the stipendiary magistrate that Friday. He was a very senior lawyer in Glasgow, but he happened to be the stipe that Friday, and so it was he who was involved in trying to get the Lord Provost to read the Riot Act, and it was he from his hands that the strikers took the Riot Act out of his hands, so he couldn't read it at the time.
That's right.
But you were making the point about Maxton and Shinwell and so many other characters who were there that weekend, on that Friday. Obviously, I think it's fair to say that the events of that Friday, at least from my perspective, were less well known for many years, at least outside Glasgow. But now they've come back to some recognition, I suppose, as we got past the centenary of the event. It's perhaps that it got more attention. What do you think? Are there lessons, do you think, from that confrontation, or is there resonance now from the events of that Friday?
Yeah, there are. I mean, I think Willie Gallagher said at the time we should have been leading a revolution. I think he was wrong. They weren't leading a revolution, they were leading a strike. But if they'd led it properly, if they'd made the links with the other shop stewards committees, if they'd gone out into the coalfields, because it wasn't just the engineers who went on strike. A lot of miners in Lanarkshire, where I came from, came out on an unofficial strike to back them. And the miners were in the middle of being balloted. And there were 1 million miners in Britain at the time. You have to understand, it wasn't like the miners' strike in '84 with 100,000 miners. Coal was king. And if the miners had gone on strike, then the British government was in serious trouble. And Mclean was arguing for the leaders of the 40-hour strike in Glasgow to hang on until the miners were out with them. and they would be able to topple the government. That was Mclean's argument. I think he was right. But even when the strike had happened, it was clear the miners were prepared to come out. I don't think they were there to lead a revolution, and they were completely taken by surprise. I think they were set up by the Tory cabinet. There's now evidence to prove there were 2 cabinet meetings that week, and they talked about a Bolshevik rising before the event. So they were using the Wilson, the army chief's fears about a Bolshevik rising to say this is what was being organised. Harry McShane, who was there and involved in the fight, and Harry McShane tells great stories about how when they were attacked by the police, they found these lorries with empty bottles in them and used them to fight back against the police. He said that we expected a revolution, but we thought it would come gradually. This was the beginning of building up a revolutionary movement. It wasn't a Petrograd 1917. It was more like the earlier beginnings of it. And there was no doubt it was a revolutionary crisis. And it wasn't the army that stopped the strike. The trade union leadership had tried to stop the strike from the start. It was by and large a rank and file unofficial strike. And I think some of the leaders, like Willie Gallagher, who'd been involved in the Clyde Workers' Committee and who'd set up the Clyde Workers' Committee on the basis, we'll back the officials as long as they back us, but the moment they don't back us, we'll act independently. They lost an element of that in the 1940-hour strike, and the officials got a hold of it. And what they did was, when it threatened to spread to London, the officials dismissed all the district committees, cut strike pay, put out stories that the strike was ended and the strike was called off. The newspapers announced the strike was over before it was, so they actually had to announce. They said they were promised by the officials if they called the strike off, the officials would call a ballot. So naively they did that. There never was another ballot. They were all rounded up. Now, there's evidence that this was planned, because Winston Churchill is quoted at the cabinet meeting as saying, what we need is a spot of bother that we can use to crack down on the leadership. Now, I think they fomented the spot of bother. The claim is that the police attacked the crowds to clear the way for the trams. There were no trams and no tram lines in the part of the square that the police launched their attack. Willie Gallagher was battened in the back of the head while he was speaking to the crowd. Davy Kirkwood came out of the meeting and tried to calm the crowd down and was battened in the head as well. So I think Mclean was right when he said it wasn't beaten by tanks and machine guns, it was beaten by an amateur preparation.
Yes, I was just reflecting on that as you were talking. I suspect that it would seem possible to me that there was perhaps a surprise, as you say, in terms of there being an escalation, and this was the beginning of an escalation. In fact, people were surprised that it escalated so quickly and maybe got a fright in a sense. And if there wasn't the organisation behind it, that would then lead to difficulty if people didn't know, if there wasn't a plan in place in that sense, an organisation. But no, it's that's very interesting. Thank you. There's a couple of questions starting to appear.
Good.
One that I know that you and I touched on when we were preparing this earlier, but Kyle's asking, what did Mclean die of? And I see folks are talking about, and Kyle's saying officially cancer or heart attack or whatever. People are suggesting consumption. There are a number of areas. So it'd be interesting to hear what you think about the causes of Mclean's very early death.
His death certificate was pneumonia. Now, pneumonia is a disease when you're run down, when you get the cold, when you're not well, when you're tired, when you've been exhausted. For a man, Mclean had been a very fit man. He was 44. So it's possible he died of pneumonia. It's also, I'm not a great conspiratorialist, but he did suffer an appalling time in prison. He was forced fed. God knows what they were force feeding him. He was in hunger strike for political status. In his second spell in prison, they had him breaking rocks, hard labour. They reckon that prisons in Scotland could compare with anything the Tsar could throw at the Bolsheviks. And Mclean got that treatment. And he went on hunger strike for political status. He didn't want to wear a prison uniform. He argued he was a political prisoner. He was for civil rights, for the right to oppose slaughter. And he was brutally treated for that and hard work. He was also poor. It's rumoured that he gave his coat it was a terrible winter, and he was out speaking. He was organising the unemployed. He would be out speaking in the streets, and he gave his coat, his only coat, to somebody that was worse off than him. And he got a terrible cold and he died of pneumonia. But I certainly think that the contributory stuff towards it is the way he was treated in prison. I don't think that murdered him. Maybe they did, maybe they drugged him. But I think it was that did him in. And it was a great loss, because I actually think, I said that I thought he was wrong not to join the Communist Party. And people say, well, look, it turned out to be this Stalinist monstrosity. It wasn't democratic. It wasn't like that when it was formed. Some of the best people that John Mclean worked with, like Gallagher and so on, he criticised them and he had disagreements with them, but they would have benefited if Mclean had joined the Communist Party, because Mclean was of an independent mind. He wouldn't take orders from anybody. He would think things through. He didn't learn his Marxism from Lenin. He learned it for himself. And he had an independent mind. Now, I'm not saying he was always right, but he would have challenged things that happened. I mean, the general strike, the Communist Party were wonderful, but they were only a few thousand members. They did the best things in the general strike, but they swallowed the line of all power to the General Council of the TUC, and the TUC sold out the strike. That would not have been Mclean's line. Mclean had been around. He would have fought and argued for a better position. Now, that's guessing, isn't it? I mean, he died in 1924, but I think if he'd been around people in 21, 22, he would have been looked after.
Of course. That's grand, thank you. We're starting to get more questions coming in. Firstly, we've got a comment from Henry Maitlis, who's commenting, just saying, I think that unlike some of the trades union leaders and Labour politicians at the time, Mclean stood very clearly with the oppressed. One good example was the way he supported the Lithuanians in Lanarkshire in their attempts to avoid starvation and get their menfolk back from Russia after the Civil War, which is I think is absolutely right. And there's a question here on Facebook from Billy Holland, an interesting topic I think we can talk for a little while about. Billy Holland on Facebook asks, has the British state always infiltrated the workers' movement from the start?
Yes. I mean, there is evidence of it still happening. I mean, if you look at what's happened in the building industry, the blacklist, if you look at the women in the peace movement who've been, actually people have married them who are spies. And, you know, there are people trying to get restitution from the British courts for being treated like that. You know, how appalling is that? And that goes back, you know, it goes back right to the Tolpuddle martyrs, you know.
Yes, yeah, I know.
Agricultural labourers that were jailed for conspiracy. The same laws were used in 1973, 72, in the building strike against the Tory government to arrest Des Warren and Ricky Tomlinson. They were elected under, jailed under conspiracy laws that go back to 1875. The conspiracy in that was it was the McAlpines of this world who funded the Tory party itself, and the chief police officers who had the conspiracy against the building workers who were picketing in the building strike. So, yeah, I do think it goes back a long way.
And Ibis is asking a question that follows on a little bit from that as a comment, really. How do we ensure that the panic growing in Westminster today doesn't lead to agent provocateur infiltrating and derailing all under one banner when things start rolling again? London will have no qualms, as they showed during the poll tax riot in Trafalgar Square. The TUC were de facto Westminster supporters, it seems. That ties back, I think, to your point about Manny Shinwell and Lord Kirkwood and others becoming
off rather than
and becoming accustomed to a London lifestyle. Something that I see is sometimes pointed at one or two Scottish politicians nowadays as well.
I mean, I don't think you can stop that. I mean, you try and stop it and so on, but it's the state's clever, you know.
Yes, and I suppose the argument would be that the security services weren't doing their job if they weren't disrupting those who they say would threaten security. Not that we do. I
mean, the interesting story is that for a long time there was a member of the Bolshevik Central Committee who led the revolution, who was actually a police spy, and 3 or 4 of the Bolshevik Central Committee used to argue with Lenin, this guy's a police spy, and Lenin trusted him. And it was only when they found, when they seized power and found the police minutes that they discovered he really was a police spy. So if they had a police spy in the Bolshevik Central Committee and they couldn't stop a revolution, it wasn't the Central Committee that made the revolution. It was the ordinary people of Russia, the soldiers, the peasants, the women textile workers. So they can have police spies and all under one banner, but they can't have police spies in the head of 100,000, 200,000, 300,000 people. We're a mass movement. We're not a bunch of conspirators. We're a mass movement.
Yes, no, it's an interesting point. People talk about only operating in groups of 3 or groups of 5. And we certainly I still hear about people operating in that way nowadays. Certainly all under one banner is quite a small organising team, not quite that small, but it is one way to address the challenges, absolutely. Julie Sherry, who I suspect your name you might recognise.
Yes.
Says the struggles during Red Clydeside were such a wonderful example of how working class people, when fighting back, have power to change things. The wonderful stories of how women led rent strikes or strikes by young and migrant women, such as in Neilston, linked up with and inspired organised sections of skilled workers. Now you can see that there was a large scale strike movement. Workers still have that power. How do you think that could come about again, where capitalism's crisis seems even more catastrophic? Thinking of the explosive Black Lives Matter movement over the impending climate disaster, and strikes that we have seen here, such as the Glasgow women's strike. How can we organise towards that kind of movement like we saw during Red Clydeside? And how do you think that connects with our fight for independence?
I think it does connect to our fight for independence, and I think it's quite important. And I think the answer's partly in the question. I mean, Black Lives Matter, who 3 months ago even would have predicted Black Lives Matter? I mean, in my introduction, I talked about that period being the highest level working class international struggle has reached, the period of, and the build up and after the Russian Revolution, an amazing period. Well, we're witnessing, not quite at that level yet, but we're witnessing that among particularly young people now. I'm astonished. I mean, I remember the civil rights movement in America in the 60s, when it was by and large black people who demonstrated. Actually, the wonderful thing about it is now is the number. I mean, of course, it's going to be predominantly black people demonstrating, but the wonderful disparity, if you like, in the movement. The different people coming together, the number of white people that are supporting it, the fact that workers are going on strike in America. I mean, I don't know how big it was, but I know that there were strikes in America against what's happening there, and that's encouraging. Before that, I mean, we're in lockdown now, but it's still there. The Extinction Rebellion. Who would have predicted that? You know, it was sweeping the world, and it's people. I mean. People used to say to me, young people are not as political as they used to be when we were younger in the 60s and the 70s. Actually, young people are much more political than we were in the 60s and the 70s, because the world is politicising people in a way. And I think any movement has to build that and link it together. The danger is that we all fight for separate issues, independence, women's rights, and I'm for them all, don't get me wrong. We need to unite them because they're all in one way or another an adjunct of capitalism, all the oppressions that people face, the lack of democracy, the lack of control, the alienation that people feel from their own jobs, never mind the government. These are things that can only be tackled when people move into action and work with each other. Now, that doesn't mean everybody's going to agree with each other, but we need to create a vehicle whereby those debates and discussions can take place. And we need socialists organised and arguing for that and leading it. And we need bigger and bigger left socialist organisation inside the movements.
Yes, yes.
That's what I think. Other people may disagree. But I think Julie's touching it. There's all these wonderful resistance movements beginning to come together, and that's my hope they can, because that is precisely what happened in that period. People began to support each other. People began to see each other's power, and people began to see how things could change. People have to change themselves, and that's what a process like that does, I think.
Yes, and if people get the taste for organisation and for preparation and planning in order to make things, in order to change things, then yes, it can be infectious if that's not an unfortunate phrase to use at the moment. But yes, people get the hang of it. There are a number of questions coming in now, some on small details, other on broader topics. Firstly, Kyle is asking, in your view, did Mary Barber and John Mclean know each other, or were they active at different times or different locations?
No, they would know each other because Mclean was very active in 1915 in the rent strike. Mary Barber was one of the leaders of it.
Yes.
He knew, for example, Helen Crawford, who was also involved in it. He was very close to Helen Crawford. Helen Crawford and Mary Barber founded the Women's Peace Crusade and organised a women's movement against the war. Because both Mary Barber and Helen Crawford had been suffragettes, but they broke with the leadership of the suffragettes movement over the war. A lot of suffragettes were anti-war, of course, but some of the leadership, particularly at the very top leadership, were giving white feathers to people who weren't going to fight and so on. So she broke with them. So he would know her. I mean, I don't have incidents of him talking to her, but he was involved in the rent strikes. He taught in Canning Park. Mary Barber was involved in the South Govan rent strikes. So Mclean would be aware of that.
Yes.
There was another one I noticed there about the race riots, which...
Yes. So that's a question there from Henry, who's saying, I wonder if Dave could talk about the contradictions of 1919.
Yes.
1 week before the 40-hour strike started and the confrontation with the state, there were race riots in Glasgow. Yeah. Dave, what do you think are the lessons for us now?
Well, there were race riots and it's been hidden a bit. And not just in Glasgow. Glasgow was the first race riots and it was in the Dockland areas, Bristol, London, Liverpool. Manny Shinwell was not a member of the Clyde Workers' Committee. Manny Shinwell was a leader of what was called the Seamen's Union, because it was all men then. It's the Seafarers' Union. Mm-hmm. And his argument, he went to speak at a meeting in the run-up. This was just a few days before the 40-hour strike started. He went to a meeting in the Brummelaw to a depot of seafarers. And he argued at that meeting they would need to fight to get legislation passed, meaning British jobs for British workers. Yes. And the industry would be full of foreign sailors, black sailors and so on. And there were groups of black sailors, Chinese sailors, Arab sailors working in Glasgow who were attacked at the depot where Shinwell spoke. A few hours after it was what was called a race riot. And it was conceding to the argument that foreign workers steal British workers' jobs, that they are different, that they are alien, racism in other words. And actually, to their credit, the Clyde Workers' Committee challenged that, because at the very time the Clyde Workers' Committee were fighting in Glasgow for the 40-hour week, the Bombay dock workers were in a huge strike. And if you read the Clyde Workers' Committee bulletin, there's a great reference in it to, we are heart and soul with our brothers and sisters in Bombay. Victory, I mean, you can read it. But the contradiction is that some people in the leadership, sometimes the trade union leaders, and we've had that. Gordon Brown said British jobs for British workers. I can remember it. Yeah. I can remember some of the leaders of the trade unions conceding to that. And it's their duty to fight that, to resist it, and to actually turn people's anger towards the real enemy, not scapegoat people because of the colour of their skin or their religion or their gender or anything else. And, you know, people often say the good thing about the rise and level of class struggle was it'll get rid of racism. Well, it doesn't. It certainly helps if people are fighting back against the real enemy. But even in high points of struggle, racism can emerge, and that's what happened. And Manny Shinwell didn't deal with it very well. I've got other criticisms of Manny Shinwell, and I'm not just scapegoating him. It's a thing that applies to lots of trade union leaders. We're aware of it today, but it has to be tackled.
I'd forgotten that Shinwell was in the Seafarers Union. I was just reflecting also, of course, with John Two Jags Prescott. I think was in the Successors Union. So they both there's maybe similar patterns of behaviour there. It's just making me smile thinking about it. Ibish is saying with the European Convention when the European Convention on Human Rights is gone, London can easily cause trouble during our marches. And then, like Churchill, that bother would be used to dirty our name and see our leaders censored or imprisoned under the new British human rights law. I'll make a comment first of all.
Yeah.
And then you, David, simply because with organising demonstrations and marches nowadays, we work very closely with Police Scotland, who allocate officers to All Under One Banner, and we and All Under One Banner has worked very hard to build an effective and efficient working relationship with Police Scotland. And Police Scotland are always very clear in their conversations with me that they see their role as facilitating the protest. It's our democratic right to assemble, and it's our democratic right to associate. And so long as we're doing it in a way that's not breaking other laws, the police see their role as facilitating it and see it as an important part of, without getting too heavy about it, the police force continuing to police by consent. And part of that, obtaining that consent, is facilitating people exercising their human their rights to assemble and associate. So that was just one. So certainly, and I have the greatest of, well, all of the old Glasgow cops that I knew were all a good. I'm 6'2", and they were all a good bit bigger than me, and they were tall, silent Highlanders and folks from the Western Isles, who would keep themselves to themselves until they were instructed to get stuck in, and then they would get severely stuck in. So I'm thinking also of old style Glasgow cops as well. But I was just talking there a little bit about it. Dave, what do you think with regard to the point about, do you think there's a risk that, like Churchill, a change in legislation or fomenting discord could be used to try and break up what we're doing now?
I mean, even although sometimes the law limits what the state can do, they just break the law when it suits them. They don't play by the rules. And sometimes we maybe need to think we shouldn't play by the rules either. But I'm not arguing that immediately we go and have a battle with the police. I'm not saying that at all. What I'm saying, though, when push comes to shove, if we're a threat, if the indie movement is a threat to the British state, and you bet your boots it is, then they will counter us any way that they can. I mean, what's it Malcolm X used to say? By any means necessary. For the people who run Britain, and there are not a lot of them, by any means necessary, they will hang on to their power. That's what they did in 1919. That's the lesson. I think demonstrations, working class demonstrations, should be kind of self-policing. In other words, you should have good stewarding. And I know All Under One Banner does, because I know some of the people that steward it. But at the end of the day, the state will attempt to break anything that challenges the state. And we have to be aware of that. We have to be prepared for it. The answer is numbers.
Yes.
And organisation, self-organisation.
Yes. Yes.
That's all we have. But it's interesting to note that in 1919, there were police strikes.
Yes.
Big police strikes.
Yes.
The army mutinied. The reason the Russian Revolution won, the workers won, is because the workers sided, the soldiers sided with the workers.
Yes, of course, there was the mutiny at Invergordon, I think.
There was Invergordon mutiny in the 1930s. Yes,
so similar circumstances. So it's a very good point. We certainly see that in terms of organising large demonstrations, we've organised 23 events on the streets, and there's never been an arrest yet. And we do everything that we can to make sure there never is an arrest, because it'll be a sign that in a sense we're not self-policing and that there's been a problem. So we work very hard to do that, and we will continue to do so. But it is a challenge. Thinking about that aspect, and thinking about the arc through. I'm old enough to remember a fair amount of the industrial action in the early and mid 1970s and up to the early 80s. In terms of the arc of industrial action starting in Scottish industrial action being organised from the time of Mclean, and now, so many of the young people we're talking about who are now beginning to organise will have no recollection, of course, and no history round about the industrial action that there was in the 60s and 70s and early 80s, up to and including the miners' strike. So do you think, are there lessons that in terms of the way in which industrial action and industrial mobilisation has evolved over time?
one of the things that really cheered me up was the Glasgow equal pay strike. You know, when people think of the working class, they look back to people in boiler suits, horny-handed sons of toils with helmets on. Actually, when you looked at George Square, it was full. I think it was 40,000 women in George Square and quite a few other workers who were supporting them on the day of their equal pay strike. It was near the anniversary of 1919, actually, because the women had placards about 1919. And actually, one of them spoke with me at a demonstration done by the Open University in George Square. One of the strikers spoke, celebrating the anniversary of 1919. The working class has changed a lot, and it always changes. The working class then was, you know, it was an industry based in coal, steel, shipbuilding, engineering. Most of those are gone. Yep. It's now call centres. I mean, we can see it. The COVID-19 has shown us who the real heroes are. The people that run the world, not the elite, but the ordinary people that drive our buses, clean our offices, and blah, 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 you know, look after our health service. Those people are workers, right? And they've got the interests, collective interest of working people all over the world. They've got something in common. And whether they know it or not, they are very powerful. If they don't work, if they don't cooperate, there's nothing these people can do. And that's the power, and it's still there. I mean, one of the strikes I remember a wee while ago was a group of women in Heathrow Airport, by and large immigrant women. The Gate Gourmet strike. They went in strike, and in support of them, the baggage handlers and other Unite members in the airport walked out in strike. And I remember watching a television programme that was saying, if Heathrow Airport closes for a day, the whole of London shuts down. It's a serious crisis in the British state. That's how powerful workers are. That's how powerful women that serve behind a counter in Heathrow Airport are if they're linked to other workers. And that power is still there. And I think it's better in the sense, it's not just workers. I mean, a lot of the people who've kicked things off for us in a way, in Black Lives Matters or in the climate change movement, aren't they workers? They're youngsters at school. They're connected to the world that we live in and are part of it and can take part in it. So these are the things we need to look to. I mean, obviously we need to build up. We need to recruit to the trade unions. This is a time, because of what's happening, when people can see why they should be in a union. I mean, I know that the English teachers have recruited massively. And my own union, Unite, has put on a lot of members. I mean, I'm very critical of the leadership. So if we're recruiting members with a lack of leadership, what would it be like if we had real leadership? So that's what we have to look forward to, I think.
I think that's very fair. We've got a question here that connects a few of the topics we've been touching on here, and we can see what your views are. So this is from JD, who's on YouTube, who's watching us on YouTube. Dave, are we witnessing the end of the union? And if we are, how do you think it will end?
It's looking like it, but it's the old anarchists used to say, if you don't hit it, it won't fall. Right? You know, in other words, we need to do something. We're not going to give in to us in a plate. Certainly not with Boris Johnson. And at the moment, I mean, who knows? I wouldn't predict anything at the moment. I mean, the world in the last 2 or 3 years is going at a rate of knots. I mean, sometimes you feel the world's getting faster because you're getting older, and that's true, but it's not just that. It is getting faster. Things are speeding up. So predictions are very difficult. There is no doubt, I think, that it can happen, but we have to fight for it and organise for it to happen. So I don't think it will. And I think it will happen if we can connect independence, the breakup of the British state, with the fight against austerity and what's happening to people, and the fight against COVID and the fight against climate change. And I think, like Mclean said, I mean, I might not agree with him in 1920, but I agree with what he said in 1920 now. If we do something English, because actually, although I believe in independence, I believe in international and working class solidarity. I believe that we've got lots of things in common with workers in Liverpool and Hampstead or anywhere else, and that we can continue to organise together, and we can do that. And I think if the Scottish people move and defeat, even if it's just by breaking from the British state, defeat the Tory setup. It'll inspire workers in England and Wales and other parts of the world as well. So we're all in it together here. So yes, I do.
I think
it's not. I don't think it's automatic. I don't think it will fall out of the trees like apples. I think we will have to. Nothing comes without agitation and struggle. Struggle brings everything.
Yes.
That's why we've got rights at all, because our mothers and fathers and grandparents fought for them and struggled for them and organised for them. And that's what we have to do.
Especially at a time when perhaps our rights are being reduced and taken away by a rapacious Westminster government. No, that's a very good point. It's a very good point indeed. We were going to also one thing that was in the back of my mind to talk to you about. And I'm pivoting here a little bit. You mentioned one of Mclean's pamphlets, "The War After the War." And this is just for everybody's information: is the War After the War in print, or is it historical?
It document? Was in print, because I've got a copy of it, but it's an old, outdated one. I think it was. Some of it is in his book, "In the Rapids of Revolution." Mm-hmm. Which may not be in print, but which people will be able to get. It's a book of his writings and stuff, and there's excerpts of that pamphlet. It was a pamphlet written for he did Marxist economic classes, Mclean. My grandfather went to his Marxist economic classes. My grandfather worked in Parkhead Forge, and worked beside Davy Kirkwood. He was a fitter, right? Yep. And Mclean, there were all these self-educated workers that Mclean talked to about Marxism. At their height, they reckon he spoke to 1,000 workers a week across Clydeside during 1917-18. He had meetings of 500 in Glasgow, but he would get to the mining areas. Henry, I think, mentioned the Lithuanian miners in Bells Hill. People maybe don't know that there was an organisation in Bells Hill founded in 1904 called the Lithuanian Social Democratic Federation. Mm-hmm. It was a second international Marxist organisation of Lithuanian miners and their families in Bells Hill. So there was no proper education for people, so people had to educate themselves. And there was a tradition in the socialist movement, and Mclean was brilliant at it. And he would write pamphlets and do lectures, but his Marxism was accessible to people who went to Mclean's classes. His gift was that he could speak to ordinary people about their life experience and make his ideas and the big ideas make their life mean sense. And that was his talent. He's not just his big ideas and his Marxism, but its connection with ordinary working class people. That was his strength. So that when the movement was knocked back, that's why Mclean became isolated, because his base was in those people, those people that he taught. And that's what the War After the War was written for. And it explains that war is the outcome of capitalist competition. Mm-hmm. You know, the idea of Gordon Brown said, globalization means we won't go back to boom and slump anymore. He said that 2 years before the 2008 collapse. You know, they always get caught out. We're headed for another one that's probably even bigger. I mean, I don't have any glee about it. It's going to cause untold misery. And if it's causing misery in places like Great Britain, God knows what it's going to be like in Southern Africa or South America or Central America. So the world's facing the biggest crisis since John Mclean lived. He lived through these crises.
Yes.
So his pamphlet deals with that, because he argued that America and Britain might go to war. No, he wasn't the only. Other socialists thought that because they could see the competition. It was actually Germany again they went to war with, and Japan. But it was over trade, profit, empire, who controls the world.
Yes.
And he said it would happen within 15 years of 1920. Well, it had started in Abyssinia then, I think. I think Italy had invaded Abyssinia, but the big stuff started in 1938-39 when Hitler invaded Poland.
But he was close.
No, my dad went to fight because he thought he was fighting fascism, but it was really a war between the great imperial powers. Churchill's interest was protecting the British Empire, not protecting the Jews, despite what they say now.
Yes. Oh, yes. It was still an imperial conflict. There's no doubt about that at all. That's absolutely clear. We've got a couple of questions from folks in the room. on a range of things. There's a comment. Firstly, we're talking about Mclean's teaching and his communication skills, and Linda's pointing out that he taught here in Little Moscow in Lunfinnans in Fife, yes. Which comes as no surprise. Kyle is asking, does Dave, do you think that John Mclean believed that Scotland should be independent?
But he didn't up until 1920. I think part of the argument, I think, was that two things, I think. He was an internationalist. He was not a nationalist, as they say. But he thought that the breakaway of Scotland would break the British Empire for two reasons. One, because he thought the Glasgow he didn't think the Glasgow working class were special and unlike the English working class. He just thought they were further advanced at that point. I actually think he was wrong, because what had happened between the end of 1919 and 1921 is the movement was smashed by unemployment. I mean, one of the things Mclean did, people say they just didn't worry about the organised workers. He built the first unemployed workers movement. Him and Harry McShane, who later came to lead the national unemployed workers movement in Scotland in the 30s, organised the unemployed. They thought it was they wanted to organise the unemployed so that workers were stick up for the unemployed. In other words, he was for the underdog. He was for the downtrodden, not just the workers. But he argued the workers should be for the downtrodden, for the underdog, for the immigrant, for the poor. Yes. And he fought all his days for that. The other thing he thought was, like Ireland, there would be a movement for Scottish independence as there would be in Ireland. The problem was, I think, that the Irish Republican movement grew in opposition to the British Empire. Actually, Scottish nationalism grows with the decline of the British Empire. People seeing that. So there wasn't a mass nationalist movement. There had been nationalism. There wasn't a mass nationalist movement then. I mean, to an extent there is now. I don't think it's so much nationalist as democratic, right? Like, a lot of national movements can be progressive. Some of them can be reactionary. British nationalism is reactionary. That's the problem, not Scottish nationalism. Yes. I mean, I'm not a Scottish nationalist, but I'm in favour of Scottish independence from the British state.
Yes, yes.
And I think that was Mclean's ideas as well, but I think he didn't realise, I mean, because we were Celtic, he said, there would be that. I think he was wrong there. I think he overestimated that.
Yes. Well, I suppose with it was his mother was from Fort William. It was from Corpach, I think. So there was a Highland.
His father was from Mull and his mother was from Fort William, or vice versa. He was born in Pollockshaw's, just up the road, but his parents were both victims of the clearances, right?
Yes. And I think the family still had the Gaelic when he was growing up. So he maybe had a slightly rose-tinted specs is maybe the wrong way of putting it, but he maybe had a view of the nature of the Celt and the Celtic Celtic persona, if there is such a thing. No, I can see that. Following on from what you were just saying, there's two questions from Lenny Harry on YouTube, which are connected really. So I'll do them at the same time. So the first question he asked was, so in terms of what we were saying, so why do you think socialists in England work so hard against Scottish independence? He says, look at George Galloway, a socialist actively working against Scottish independence. Does he not want a good example of a socialist state on these islands?
Okay.
And we're not asking you to answer for George Galloway there, by the way.
No, but I'll answer though. But I want to. George Galloway and a number of people, well, I hasten to say not all socialists in England are like that. Actually, I know a lot of socialists well, what they say is, it's not up to us, it's up to the Scottish people to determine for themselves. But I support their right to do that. And that's what we should be asking people to say, right? We're not wanting England to have a vote whether we can exert independence, but we should have workers in England. It's in their interest that people in Scotland have the right to break for the British state. And there are lots of socialists in England, I would think, do that. I know a lot who do. There are people who ever say it's breaking up working class unity. And that may well be George Galloway's argument. No, I haven't spoken to him for a wee while. I used to speak to George. He was involved in Stop the War. I was involved in Stop the War. And he did some good things, but he's completely wrong in this. He's completely wrong in this. Because actually it's anti-democratic. It's clear now. I mean, it was even when people we didn't have a majority for Scottish independence. People still have the right to express their opinion and their views and the right to have a referendum.
Yes.
And they do again. But it's actually quite clear now that probably a majority of the Scottish people would go for it now, right? Would go for it now.
Yes, yes. And actually that ties
so
back.
It's undemocratic at Galloway or anybody else in the socialist movement who says you've got no right to do that. You've had your vote, bugger off. And that's what they're saying. And I think it's partly mistaken because the unity of the British working class is not about borders and it's not about being in the same state. It's the unity of the working class, not the British working class or the Scottish working class. It's the unity of the working class.
Yes.
If we have a fight with the British state to break away, we will need the support of workers around the world, just as the Catalonians did. You know, and that could happen. Yeah. Most folk will hope that doesn't happen. I suspect we will have to step up, struggle.
Yes.
That's what I think. And therefore,
I think
it's the duty of socialists to support the right of self-determination, whether people choose to exercise the right of self-determination. Like, I'm in favour of the right of divorce. I don't argue that everybody should get divorced, right? But everybody has the right to be divorced if they want to, the right to separate, right?
Yes, no, I think that's absolutely right. And one thing I was going to say to you, and it slipped my mind for a moment. We were talking before about the motivations and about the reasons behind some of the reasons associated with the organisation and the planning that went into so much of Red Clydeside at the time, and was very much at the forefront of organising, obviously inspired with what was happening in Russia, but was doing it in its own way here as well. Without drifting off the point too far, I listened to a lady who had called into James O'Brien's show on LBC 2 days ago, a lady from Scotland called Maggie, who is a No to Yes voter, and she was saying that her motivation for her journey from No to Yes was that with Brexit and COVID, she felt scared and she felt she wasn't being protected, and she felt that independence would make her feel better protected, learning from the experience of Brexit, learning from the experience of the way in which COVID's handled. So in terms of people's motivation to organise in 1919 to protect, or to seek to protect and to seek to establish rights, perhaps we're seeing some similar motivations at the moment with some No to Yes people who feel that either organising in a trades union or organising to seek independence in order that we can then have more direct effect and more direct control over what is done to us. There may well be connections there, perhaps. This is not about me speaking. Stephen Buck McDowell on Facebook asks, and I'm not sure if you're aware of this, but he's asking anyway. Dave, what do you think of the Scottish Digital Covenant? Do you think that it would be helpful in the advancement of independence?
I really don't know what it is. I'm sorry. I will try and answer questions, but I won't try and answer questions I
don't know the answer to.
Know the answer to. I'm hoping it's probably a positive thing that we can help, but maybe somebody else in the audience knows a bit more about it than me, can comment it. So I'm sorry for my ignorance, but
no, that's quite all right.
I don't know much about it.
No. It's of course it is one of a number of initiatives in order to try and organise and to do so in a way that uses modern technology. Kyle's asking, what do you think Mclean would have thought of the European Union, which Kyle says has made the Mediterranean the biggest graveyard in the world?
I think he would have been for a socialist Europe, right? But we haven't got a socialist Europe at the moment. My view is, this will cause controversy. I've never agreed with the European Common Market. I always thought it was a boss's club. I feel like I'm a European. It's not that I don't like Europe. I love Europe. I'd go there on my holidays any day of the week. I like people, right? So I'm not anti or a little Englander or anything like that. I just think it's a boss's club, right? And I think it's the point that Kyle makes is also true. A lot of people that I know, for the best reasons, actually thought it would be good to stay in Europe because it would tame the far right of the British state. It would be better for immigrants and so on. I don't think it is. If you look at the record of Europe, Fortress Europe is an old phrase of Hitler's, You know, Festung Europa was when he put the walls around Europe, is really what they're doing to the Middle East, people from the Middle East and North Africa. You can get in if you get blue eyes, or if they want you. But most people are. I mean, look at the treatment of the refugees in Calais. No, that's not any worse than the British government would do. It's not a defence of Britishness at all. But actually, I don't support it. That doesn't mean I don't speak to anybody that's in favour of staying in Europe. There's lots of people in the indie movement. I know that the majority of Scots voted to stay.
Yes.
I'm a Democrat, so I'll go with what people want. But that's my opinion.
Yeah.
I think a lot of the good things that people think we get from Europe are actually, if you think of the equal pay law, know that there's equal pay, but these things were fought for by ordinary people. We didn't get them from benevolent people from above. I mean, it's better to have benevolent people from above, but we don't rely on them. We have to rely on ourselves, I think, to change things.
Definitely. No,
so that's what I think about Europe. It's also incredibly bureaucratic. It's power. People feel remote. I think it's one of the reasons why the right are able to agitate against it so much, you know. And when I mean the right, I mean the real racist nationalists, right?
Yes, no, absolutely.
Because it's so bureaucratic and undemocratic. And look what it did. My final point is look what it did to Syriza in Greece. Greece voted.
Yes.
They basically screwed Greece.
Yeah, no, it's a fair point, well made. Our good friend Kevin Gibney at Indie Live Radio has got a question. He says, Dave, nationalist is a contentious term for many. I see myself as a nationalist, but it is defined for me as simply somebody who wants independence for their country. In those terms, does that not make you a nationalist as well, Dave?
No, I'm an internationalist. I don't have a problem with people that describe themselves as nationalist unless they're in the National Front or the British National Party.
Yes.
Or, you know what I mean?
Yes.
I'm in favour of the breakup of the British state, but I'm in favour of a better Scotland, not just a separate Scotland. Yes. I mean, Scotland's got the right to be an independent capitalist nation, right? I would be for a workers' republic in Scotland like John Mclean, or the modern equivalent of that, which is local democratic control decided by the people who produce.
Yes.
And kids, you know, children have got a right to be consulted. It's not just workers who've got a wage. It would be the unemployed. There would be assemblies of people that would decide things. I mean, they wouldn't always agree. People would need to decide, are they building a hospital or are they building something else? What do they do with the resources? How do they treat the planet? I've got no blueprint for it. People will work it out for themselves. But what I do believe in is that it would be a better world run that way than run by an elite who want to fight each other for the what we produce and steal it off us.
Yes.
So I don't consider myself a nationalist, but I don't have trouble working with people who do. And I'm quite happy to be part of a movement like this.
Of course.
I hope nice Kevin doesn't take offence. I'm not kidding.
I'm sure that he won't.
Why am I an internationalist?
I've got a question for myself, actually. I just wanted to touch on one thing. We were moving away a little bit from independence and moving back to Mclean. Mclean's trial for sedition at the High Court in Edinburgh was quite an event by all accounts. He represented himself. He refused to plead. He did everything that he could to disrupt in the way that you would expect. And I think when he addressed the court, he spoke for 75 minutes without stopping. Do you have any thoughts about what Mclean's reflection was on the experience of being, and this is a man who had been through the criminal justice system in other ways, but do you think the experience of the trial had any effect on Mclean and the way he approached things?
I think he single-mindedly saw it as his ability or a chance to speak. He wasn't appealing to the judge or the jury. I think, when he said that, I mean, it wasn't a very. I mean, one of the lines is where he said, "I'm not appealing to the jury," so they obviously felt miffed, right? But what he said, he was appealing He was using it as a platform to speak to the world, to the people outside.
Yes.
And he did. And that's why, I mean, 75 minutes is a bit long, but he could speak, John. You know what I mean?
Yes. Yes.
And it was the last chance he was going to get to speak for a while. So he took his... What he said is, I'm not going to be silenced. Nobody's going to take from me my right to speak out for what I believe is right and for great injustices that are happening in this world. People are being murdered. I'm not, as he said, the accused. I'm the accuser here. I'm accusing the system you're representing.
Yes, yes, yes. Well, that's very good.
It's to his credit that he did it. Whether it was in his best personal interest or not, you could debate. But he saw it as in the interest of his class to say that.
Yes.
And that's why he's such a character, such a authentic voice of working people, I think.
Yes, yes, no, that's absolutely right. Well, that was fantastic. Thank you. I managed to squeak a wee question in there myself at the end, just to and that because I was interested in the trial.
Thank you for listening as well.
And I completely agree that trials of that nature, big political trials, do provide a huge platform for the accused and ought to be used in that way. What I was going to say is that this evening has progressed particularly well. There's one quick question that I should have asked you at the top with regard to your with regard to the books that you've written, Dave. Where would people who would like to purchase them, where would they go to get them?
You get them from Bookmarks, which is, I mean, I maybe somebody can put it up or can do it future with the details for Bookmarks. It's the London bookshop, but they do all those books. They do lots of other books than socialist books, but they do. But it's a socialist bookshop. It's the socialist bookshop of the TUC.
All right. Well, that's great. What we'll do is I'll go and find them, and we will put up.
I'll get the stuff to you, and you can put it out. I should have probably had that with me, but I'm not that well prepared.
We'll put up a link and make sure that people
online who knows it, and
we'll do that.
Get a link for where they are.
Yes, no, we'll definitely do that. Oh, more than happy to do that. What I was going to say also was, Dave, thank you for agreeing to spend your Friday evening with us. And thank you for your insights, your thoughts, and your ideas that we heard through the discussion. I can see that everybody thoroughly enjoyed all of the discussion. It's clear that everyone enjoyed it immensely. I'm seeing comments coming in saying that just now. What I should say quickly is that on Saturday, the 1st of August, there would have been an all under one banner march in Kirkcaldy. We were working extremely hard on the arrangements, and we were expecting it to be a fantastic event. Instead, for now, there will be an online Ceilidh on Broadcasting Scotland that evening. We're hoping to have as many performers who are local to Fife taking part, and maybe one or two wee surprises as well. So please search for Broadcasting Scotland on YouTube and enjoy the show on the evening of Saturday, the 1st of August. All Under One Banner will host more online talks and discussions here on Zoom through July and August and beyond. Coming up next are a legal panel discussion with Mike Daly, Michael Gray and Caroline Welsh. They'll talk about the limits of the legal limits of devolution and some of the legal aspects associated with Section 30. And then we'll have a historical discussion after that about the borders of Scotland with Bruce Fumi. And Bruce will talk about how the Scottish borders came to be. So please look out for them on All Under One Banner social media. And we're also in the course of planning further events. And so if anybody's got any suggestions of topics or people that they would like to hear us talking to here on Zoom on a Friday night, then please let us know by messaging our Facebook page. There will, as I mentioned, be demonstrations in the months ahead. Each of them will be extremely carefully organised and appropriate for the circumstances that we will find ourselves in at that time. More information about those will be posted on Facebook and All Under One Banner's other social media in the near future. As I mentioned at the beginning, if people would like to participate in those demonstrations, they will have to register with us, which is very unusual for us. But in order to allow contact tracing to be carried out if required, we need people to register. So please go to the All Under One Banner website, which is AUOB.org, and you'll find a registration page there for those demonstrations. All Under One Banner is persevering through the current circumstances, and I know that everyone else is doing their best too. We're not going away, and we will continue to campaign for independence. You will see announcements in the press and online during the rest of this month, and we are working away behind the scenes on a number of things for the months to come. But in the meantime, I would like to say thank you again to Dave. I'd like to say thanks to folks who are helping behind the scenes, and to thank everyone else who's been joining us here tonight, especially those who came with such great questions and helped the conversation move forward so well. So thank you, Dave. Thank you, everyone else, for your help this evening and for your participation. In the meantime, we are all under one banner. Good night.
Good night. Thank you.
Hello, my name's Steve B and I'm a presenter on Indie Live Radio. I present Music and Musings every Friday night at 7. The music, that's 70s classic rock, although we will take the occasional side road. The musings, well, they're thoughts on Scottish independence, politics and world events from my viewpoint, which is that of a grumpy old man. So join me every Friday night at 7 on Indie Live Radio, a new voice for a new Scotland.
Hi, I'm Fiona from Clackman and Show Women for Independence. Did you know we have a podcast on Indie Live Radio? Goes out at 10 o'clock on a Tuesday morning, repeated at 6 o'clock on a Thursday. Come and join us for some news, views, opinions, the odd poem. It'd be very nice to have you with us. And come and hear the news you're not getting. Here's some new voices for a new Scotland at Indie Live Radio.
You can watch this again, maybe part of it. It's Independence Live. Yeah. A few people asked about YouTube. It'll be YouTube/Independence Live. That's where you'll find the footage.
No Westminster. No Westminster, come on. No Westminster, not for me, not for me. But before I'll be your slave, I'll be buried in my grave and go home to my Lord and be free. Oh, freedom, come on. Oh, freedom. Oh, freedom, one more. Oh, freedom over me. But before I be your slave, I'll be buried in my grave. go home to my Lord and be free.
Wherever you stand, get the fresh view of what's happening in Scotland with iScot. Celebrate everything about our country with intelligent, in-depth insight from lifestyle, culture to puzzles, and all the opinions you'll need. Whether it's digital or by post, subscribe now to iScot.